now. When we reach the end and we do some questions and answers, feel free to unmute yourselves, but please put yourself back on mute after you've asked your question. All right, so let's get started. There's a lot of stuff going on in Israel right now, including ongoing troubles with the coronavirus and whatnot. But obviously the only thing anyone's talking about at the moment are the Abraham Accords and Israel's newfound peace with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, and possibly other nations to follow in the near future. Some are calling this the dawn of a new Middle East. The new Middle East is a term that Shimon Peres and others liked to throw about some 25 to 30 years ago when the Oslo Accords were first getting going. That did not materialize, and we will wait and see whether it's going to actually happen this time. Get here on the slideshow. So we've witnessed a very sudden shift in the Middle East over the past month. And it has left, for the time being, most Israelis very, very euphoric. But it has also raised a lot of questions. And this is particularly true for those of us who are watching these events through a biblical lens. That includes many Israelis, and it includes, of course, all of our friends abroad. So today I want to try to take a look at some of the lesser known aspects of the Abraham Accords and try to explore some of the questions that have been raised by these developments. First, I want to take a minute and talk about the positive effects of these developments, or at least what seem to be positive effects for now. Now, as I noted, Israelis are generally very euphoric over their newly inked deals with the UAE and Bahrain. As you guys are probably all aware, as Israel observers, as lovers of the state of Israel and the Jewish people and God's plans in this land, Israelis are dreamers. For thousands of years, they dreamt of doing what no exiled people in the history of the world had done before in reclaiming their ancient homeland and reestablishing their quote-unquote kingdom. After they returned to this land, they further dreamt of building a successful and strong haven for the Jewish people, and that despite the fact that they faced insurmountable odds. And once they had done that, they dreamt for the next few decades that they would somehow have peace with the Arab world. As such, the Abraham Accords are for Israelis a dream come true. So the immediate benefits of this development that have Israelis currently very excited include regional tourism. Regional tourism. Israelis love to travel. Anyone who's been here knows that. Anyone who's been in Asia or Europe knows that. Anyone who's been in California knows that. But it's very expensive to do so in Europe, and even more so in the Americas. Asia is a bit cheaper, but it takes a very long time to fly there because Israelis typically have to go all the way around Saudi Arabia or up through Russia and then back down. Now, with these new accords, we can fly straight through the rest of the Middle East, cutting hours off of those flight times. So Israelis are pretty excited about that. Israelis are excited about the business opportunities. Israel's high-tech sector is already gearing up for a fresh wave of business deals and new markets in the oil-rich Gulf states. And the same goes for Israel's medical, agro-tech, and defense industries. Those countries in the Gulf are excited about teaming up with the Israeli counterparts. It also means, and it's another example to Israelis, that they are not alone. Israel, and indeed the Jewish people, have been singled out for their entire existence. And while that is by divine design, God said this would be the way it is, it does get very lonely for Israelis and for the Jewish people. Israelis crave friends, and that's why they love Christian Zionists so much. And as opposed to the deals that we previously had with Egypt and Jordan, the Emirati people, and indeed the people of Bahrain as well, seem to be genuinely happy about making peace with Israel. So we're going to see how that develops. Netanyahu has said it a few times now, and he is right, that strength is the path to peace in the Middle East. For decades, the West has tried to broker peace its own way by Western rules according to Western sensibilities, but that does not work in the Middle East. Of course, even the path of strength, at least the way that Netanyahu speaks of it, which you can see in his quote right here that he has said a couple of times, including from the balcony of the White House yesterday, as he speaks of it, it is still a man-made path to peace. And we'll get into that aspect of all of this later. Whatever the eventual outcome of these accords, Israelis, for the meantime, are determined to enjoy this respite from hostility in our region and this opportunity to finally work with, rather than argue with, some of our neighbors. Now we're going to get into some of the question marks that surround this deal and some of the aspects that have some Israelis at least feeling a little bit uneasy. To facilitate the stunning shift that we have seen, Netanyahu had to choose between peace and imposing Israeli sovereignty over the Jordan Valley and other parts of Judea and Samaria. This process was erroneously referred to as an annexation, although it was not annexation because this territory was not sovereignly controlled by anyone else. It was in dispute. Now, from a politician's point of view, Netanyahu is a politician, let's remember, the choice was an easy one. The people want peace. They want to watch dramatic signing ceremonies on TV. They want to see their leaders sit on the White House lawn with Arab leaders. A survey conducted just this month by Channel 12, you can see the results of it there on the bottom of this slide, showed that a full 80% of Israelis preferred rapprochement with the Arab world over sovereignty in Judea and Samaria. It's been this way since the very beginning, actually. Israel has always preferred territorial concession to fighting for the land. After all, let's remember that all the way back in 1947, Israel accepted the UN partition plan. The Arabs rejected it, but Israel was ready to partition the land. Now, this is an understandable position for the Israelis back then and still today, because while many Christians abroad tend to look at Israel through a prophetic lens only, we need to remember that Israelis, and even many Messianic Jews among them, and we're talking about believers here who do believe in the same set of prophecies, they will still argue that while they know that all of this is going to happen, they and their children are the ones that have to actually go into battle, actually have to fight these wars and fight these battles. So if there's a chance of delaying or putting off all of these conflicts, they'll take it. Another possibility that we have to seriously consider, and that is being talked about in the media here of late, is that Netanyahu's not a dummy. He is Israel's most brilliant politician. He might be the world's most brilliant politician. And he knew all of this about his fellow Israelis and what they prefer. So it has been strongly hinted that his determined push for an annexation over the past year, he's been pushing this hard for a year, that it was actually coordinated beforehand with Trump and with UAE Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed, because we now know that Netanyahu and Crown Prince bin Zayed actually met secretly a year ago. So the idea behind these rumors and behind these hints is that by threatening annexation and making it look like a looming inevitability, Netanyahu provided the UAE and some other Gulf states with the straw man that they needed to finally make a deal with Israel that they've been wanting to make for a really long time, but they felt that they couldn't because they would be branded as traitors to the Palestinian cause, to the Arab cause, to whatever else. But by swooping in and claiming that by normalizing relations with Israel, that they have stopped the annexation, that they have saved the Palestinian state, that they have saved the two-state solution, they actually can claim to be heroes to the Palestinian cause. The Palestinians don't see it that way at present, but it provided the UAE with a convenient excuse. At least that's the way that some commentators are approaching this at the moment. Now, Israeli officials continue to insist that the sovereignty movement for Judea and Samaria is not off the table. Israeli ambassador to the UN, Gilad Erdan, who was at the signing ceremony yesterday, he reiterated quite forcefully that annexation sovereignty will be back on the table in the near future. But there are also reports that the normalization with the UAE will happen in phases, precisely to prevent Israel from putting annexation back on the table too soon. And there are reports that Trump has promised the UAE and Bahrain that he will not even consider supporting Israeli sovereignty in Judea and Samaria until at least 2024, which is his last year in office, of course, if he wins the upcoming election. And as we all know, and as Israel has actually admitted, they will not go through with such a move without an American green light. Another thing that means that we need to keep in mind is that if Trump loses in November and Joe Biden becomes president, that basically means that annexation of the Jordan Valley is off the table for the foreseeable future. which is why a lot of Israelis, especially to the right of the political spectrum, were arguing that this was our one and only chance to impose, to apply sovereignty, and that it has now been missed for the sake of normalization of the Gulf states. Whether that was worth it or not remains to be seen. Now, sadly, the Abraham Accords have also revealed and exposed just how deep the rift is in Israeli society today. Ironically referred to as the peace camp, much of the Israeli left has been dismissive, at best, of the peace deals precisely because of Netanyahu's involvement and nothing else. Those who previously accused Netanyahu of being unable or unwilling to do what was necessary for peace, those same people just last week turned up at Ben Gurion Airport to demonstrate against him in an attempt to delay or prevent his departure for Washington. So the divisions in Israel are now so severe that even the prospect of peace doesn't seem to be enough to bring the two sides together, even in temporary celebration. And that is another point of concern for prayer, and something that we worry about here deeply in the land. Now, one of the big reasons to criticize the deal, and something that the left has been bringing up a lot, but also on the right, is the potential sale of F-35s to the UAE. But it needs to be remembered that these same people, especially on the left, who are criticizing the potential sale of these jets to the UAE, these were the same people who hailed Israel's surrender of strategically important territory in various deals to the Palestinians, and who actually advocated giving the Golan Heights back to the Syrians, which we all now know would have been catastrophic. So we need to ask ourselves the question, is letting America sell advanced fighter jets to an Arab state that seems sincere in its desire for peace and which is most certainly an ally in the fight against Iran, is that somehow more risky than the proposed surrender of strategic territories? Now, as believers, we also need to keep the perspective that it's not Israel's qualitative military edge that makes the Jewish state unbeatable. There was no qualitative military edge in 1948, 1956, or 1967. Israel was outnumbered and outgunned in all of those wars and still emerged victorious, and not because it had good weapons. Not because it had American weapons. In some of those wars, it had no American weapons. Now we're going to get to one of the big points here, which is Iran. This is a big point for Israel. It's a big point for the UAE. It's a big point for Bahrain. And it's a big point for a lot of other Gulf states that are reportedly lining up to follow suit. There's been some talk in the Israeli media and elsewhere, of course, that Trump strong-armed these countries into this agreement in order to score points ahead of the US election. That could be. And I'm sure that's an element of what we're seeing. But we have to also consider the motivations of the Gulf states themselves. And in particular, the motives related to the US election in those Gulf states. The Gulf states were just as, if not more, outraged than Israel by Obama's nuclear deal with Iran. These Gulf states, and in particular Bahrain and the UAE, which if you look on a map are dangerously close to Iran, they are far more threatened by Iran today than Israel is. Even though Iran threatens to destroy Israel constantly, it also wants to take over these countries. Now, these countries fear that if Joe Biden wins in November, the US will return to a more conciliatory approach to Iran. And that will embolden the Ayatollahs and again encourage Iranian aggression in the region. So they saw it as critical to take this opportunity now, while Trump is still in office, while they could still get the terms that they wanted and needed to secure military and security cooperation with Israel. Another concern, especially among those who were paying attention 27 years ago when the Oslo Accords were signed, and I want to point out that the Abraham Accord yesterday was signed on the exact date that the Oslo Accords were signed on the Hebrew calendar. So basically, I'm really talking about Israelis who are aged 40 and over, people who were paying attention to the news and politics 27 years ago. A concern for those people, for those Israelis, is that these developments will ultimately result in increased pressure on Israel. Just 1 second, guys. I'm going to increase my volume, I've been asked. I'm not sure I can increase my mic volume. Okay, if everyone can hear me fine, I'm going to continue. So, a lot of Israelis of this generation are fearing increased pressure. Now, what we have going on here with the Abraham Accords is effectively the Saudi or Arab Peace Initiative of 2002. This is that deal in reverse. They are first giving Israel the normalization that it craves, and then they're going to press for a Palestinian state. And this is, in fact, what the UAE has openly said it plans to do. So there's no surprise there. Now, Netanyahu and many in Israel are banking on the Palestinians remaining impossibly stubborn, as they have for decades now, and rejecting all compromise, and thereby enabling Israel and Netanyahu to simply maintain the status quo in regards to the Palestinians as we move forward with the other Arab states. But it needs to be kept in mind that this new model does provide an opportunity for America and for the Arabs to apply more pressure than ever before on Israel to meet Palestinian demands even without reciprocity. The world's been doing that to Israel for decades, of course, demanding concessions even when the Palestinians didn't keep their end of the bargain. Having some Arab states now within our circle, our immediate circle, is going to increase that pressure, no doubt. But let's say that everything has been handled as it should have been. Everything is on the up and up here. There is still the fact that Netanyahu won't be our prime minister forever. And with his current legal woes, Bibi's days at the top might be more limited than we think, unfortunately. What happens when Israel gets a new prime minister, a less experienced prime minister, a prime minister more susceptible to international pressure? That's a question we must ask. Because now, once that person comes in, he or she will be faced not only with American, European, and UN pressure, but they will also have to face new pressure from the Arab economic, security, and diplomatic partners that we are today making, and partners that will press us harder than the rest of the world even to make concessions to the Palestinians for the greater good of the whole region. It's going to be harder than ever to say no to them. Now, it's no secret that the Arab world, and the Gulf states in particular, are nearly as fed up with the current Palestinian leadership as Israel is. But that doesn't mean that they have abandoned the Palestinian cause, and that's for various reasons, Islam being one of them, and we'll get to that in a little bit. In order to overcome the obstacle of the current rejectionist Palestinian leadership, there is a lot of speculation at present that the efforts behind the Abraham Accords included bringing this man that you see here, Mohammed Dahlan, back into the picture with the aim of effecting regime change in the Palestinian Authority. Okay, now Dahlan is a very interesting character. His background and story really deserves and requires its own presentation, so I'm not going to get into too much of it. I'll just touch on a few of the highlights. Dahlan was a prodigy of Arafat, Yasser Arafat, but he began to rock the boat when he pushed for reforms, sweeping reforms within the Palestinian Authority. Now, this made him very popular with the Palestinian people and very unpopular with the leadership. He spent years as the de facto Palestinian Authority warlord of the Gaza Strip, which he ruled with an iron fist. But from Israel's perspective, that was preferable because he was able to effectively keep Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and other such groups in line. He cooperated, and some say even collaborated, on a regular basis with Israeli security and intelligence. But ultimately, his willingness to work with Israel and his demands for reform within the Palestinian Authority got Dahlan exiled. And he resides today, guess where? In the United Arab Emirates. He is seen by Israel as very pragmatic, but with authoritarian tendencies. However, this of course puts him in the very same class as our new Emirati friends. And he is seen by Israel as the natural and preferred successor to current Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas. Now, all of this equals a real fear, or feeds a real fear that what is happening today will result in the ultimate division of the land. Especially for those of us who read the Bible, who believe that Israel is here because of prophetic fulfillment. Because if a more moderate, pragmatic, and cooperative Palestinian leader emerges, someone like Mohammed Dahlan manages to take power, then Israel will come under truly unprecedented pressure, both from within and without, to surrender the biblical heartland. And at that point, it won't have the convenient excuse of the rejectionist Palestinian leadership that we have today to reject these demands, to say no. The only thing it will have to fall back on is the faith-based excuse, which the rest of the world does not accept. And should that scenario play out, what today looks like the dawn of a new era of peace and coexistence could ultimately, and very quickly really, end with Israel standing entirely alone, shunned as an extremist regime even by its allies in Washington. Now, there's another path that this could all go, and the alternative to this thinking is that in the face of an attempted Dahlan takeover that is backed by Israel and the US and the Gulf states, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, who will by that point feel that he is up against the wall and has nothing to lose, he will almost certainly team up with Hamas. Hamas hates Mohammed Dahlan even more than the Palestinian Authority does. And even though the Palestinian Authority and Hamas do not get along today, they will band together for the sake of their own survival, and they will band together for the sake of realizing the goal of defeating Israel. Now, if these two sides of the Palestinian Authority and Hamas do team up, this could lead to a fresh wave of Palestinian violence, which Israel will be compelled to suppress. And in that case, we will very quickly see what the Abraham Accords are made of. What was cause for celebration today could very suddenly become the catalyst for the next outbreak of violence. And it must be remembered that we have seen this before. As I mentioned, 27 years ago exactly, the Oslo Accords were signed, and at that time, Israelis went out into the streets and danced, thinking that all of their troubles were finally behind them. How wrong they were. At the same time, Israel can't and will not allow the threat of Palestinian violence to prevent it from moving forward. The question is if it has taken the right path or if it has walked that path correctly. And finally, we arrive at the problem of Islam, which cannot be ignored. Sadly, this aspect is all but ignored by Western and even most Israeli politicians. But as we all here know, there is no separation of religion and state in the Islamic world. And so the teachings, the doctrines, the edicts that guide and shape the Muslim communities around this region, they are very, very much relevant to the decisions that their national leaderships make. This is more than simple nationalistic ideology that can be educated away in a generation. This is religious belief, centuries old, millennia old religious belief, and which in turn forms the foundation of today's nationalistic ideologies. Their religious belief that the Jews cannot be trusted, which you see in that verse that I've put up here now. I don't like to quote the Quran in writing very often, but I need to put it up here because this is important. They say that Allah is telling the Muslims that they are not to align themselves with Jews or Christians because the Jews and Christians are aligned with one another. Interestingly enough, the Muslims recognize this while most Christians do not. And that whoever allies with them is seen as a Jew or a Christian themselves. So you begin to understand from this verse also why it is such an insult in the Muslim world for a Muslim to call another Muslim a Jew. It basically means that that person is a hypocrite and an apostate. So but it needs to be remembered too that these religious beliefs that the Jews cannot be trusted, these are no less strong than the Jews' religious beliefs. They have a divine mandate to settle this land. This is not something that's going to go away. And the Arabs have been indoctrinated with this for decades in regards to the state of Israel, but for millennia regarding their religion and the Jewish people as a whole. So they are, it is ingrained in them to see the state of Israel and even the Jewish people as enemies of their religion, of Islam itself. And that has engendered a hatred among pious Muslims that is not going to be erased by the signing of the normalization agreements, even if the leaders of the UAE and Bahrain are sincere. Remember that decades ago, former Egyptian President Anwar Sadat was also seemingly very, very sincere in making peace with Israel. He even dared to come to Jerusalem and speak in the Knesset, even when the whole world would not recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. He came there and spoke in the Knesset. But even then, dreams of a genuine peace and cooperation with Egypt never materialized. And most today would describe the history of the Israeli-Egypt peace deal as cold at best. And just a few years ago, the Muslim Brotherhood briefly took over Egypt, and we were reminded that we could very suddenly return to a state of war. So Islam cannot be ignored in all of this. These peace deals were not made in isolation from the religion of these countries in a vacuum. This remains an important aspect of everything that happens in the Middle East. And it could suddenly and without warning backfire. Now, I want to take a little bit different look because some Israeli news blogs have been looking at it from a more biblical prophetic point of view. One blog in particular, a few weeks ago after the announcement of the UAE deal, wrote that according to some of the Jewish commentaries regarding the 38th chapter of Ezekiel, the location of ancient Sheba and Dedan, they are in the Arabian Peninsula. The United Arab Emirates are in the exact same area. So could it be that Ezekiel was referring to this place and the people that we know from there today when he made this prophecy so many centuries ago, end quote. So the first part of Ezekiel chapter 38 it has the prophet delivering a divine message to Gog and Magog, whom the Lord intends to hook into a war with Israel. Later on in that chapter, Ezekiel prophesies that the people of Sheba and Dedan, which again are possibly in the Arabian Peninsula, according to some Jewish commentaries, that these nations will speak out against Gog for his aggression against Israel. And you see verse 13 up there on the screen, Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish and all its leaders will say to you, to Gog, have you come to seize spoil? Have you assembled your host to carry off plunder, etc., etc.? Through Ezekiel, the Lord indicates further on in the next verse, the timing of this event. The timing of this event is, quote, on the day when my people Israel are dwelling securely. So, again, quoting from this Israeli news blog, Israel has been dwelling securely in her land for some years now. So that would seem to line up with verse 14. But what has been missing up until now is the kind of relationships with any of our neighbors that would cause them to actually speak up in Israel's defense. That is, until now. Unlike the cold peace that exists between Israel and her immediate neighbors in Jordan and Egypt, the Israel-UAE relations look to be genuinely warm and mutually beneficial. We could easily see in a future scenario if a country of the north, whether it's Gog and Magog or Turkey or whoever else or whatever else, if they resort to aggression against Israel, we could see the UAE and Bahrain speaking up on Israel's behalf and condemning such action. So there's a possibility that this does indeed line up with Ezekiel. Now, before we move on to a time of questions and answers, I want to encourage all of you, first of all, before we go on to a couple of written in questions as well, to register for next week's Zoom meeting with David Lazarus. He will be discussing the prophetic, spiritual, and practical implications of the upcoming fall feasts. That will take place next Tuesday at 8 p.m. Israel time. And I will repost the link where you can register in tomorrow's newsletter. Now, we had a couple of questions sent in by email that I want to address. The first came from Nancy Benson, who noted that Trump is moving at lightning speed diplomatically, and she wondered how we in Israel view the rapidity of his actions. So I kind of touched on this in a couple of different places in the earlier slides. And many Israeli commentators, as I noted, have done so as well, that Trump is no doubt looking to score some points ahead of the election in November. At the same time, it needs to be remembered that deals like the one that was signed yesterday do not happen overnight. That deal has certainly been in the works for months and possibly years. As I noted, We now know that Netanyahu met with the Crown Prince of the UAE already a year ago. It's very, very possible that they discussed laying the groundwork for this deal already back then. Whether it was a ploy with the threat of annexation or not, they almost certainly spoke about this. So this is not something that just happened overnight with Trump calling up the UAE and strong-arming them into doing something. Otherwise, they're not going to get American money or jets or whatever else. Nancy then also asked how Americans should view all this, noting that as Christians, they should continue to pray for Jesus' return, for true peace to come, knowing that man-made peace will not last. Now, really, this kind of touches on the reason that I wanted to do this whole short presentation and bring up all these different points today, some of which are not being talked about so widely, unfortunately. The Abraham Accord is exciting. It is unprecedented, and Israelis are going to enjoy it while they can. It is causing a lot of excitement. But after decades of war and the collapse of the hope that everyone placed in the Oslo Accords, I think that more Israelis are today aware that anything established by the hands of man is going to be temporary. We also had a question written in by George, who asked if all of this is leading to the building of the third temple. That is a point that I don't want to engage in too much. I don't like to engage in far-reaching prophetic speculation. Obviously, everything that's happening here is ultimately working towards the finale of God's plan. And where we are on that timeline, I really don't know. I don't want to speculate. People have speculated before and been way, way off, and I don't think that's helpful. But the Bible does call on us to be aware of what's happening, to recognize the signs of the times, and to be ready, to not be ignorant of what's going on, to not be ignorant of what it means. But I don't think that it calls on us to engage in speculation. So I'm going to end now with the slideshow on this. I will just touch on a few brief points, of course. Two other major issues happening right now is that Israel is the first country to enter into a second nationwide lockdown over the coronavirus epidemic. Israel's numbers are going up rapidly, daily infection rates. However, that could also very much be a result of the fact that Israel is testing a lot more people every day. There are a growing number of Israeli experts, doctors, scientists, former health ministry officials, and other experts who are demanding a recount of the death toll, suggesting that not everyone who's been counted as a corona death should necessarily be counted as a corona death, and insisting that the current approaches are engaging in hysteria and perhaps we need to scale it back. We should shield those who are vulnerable, but shutting down the entire country, shutting down schools, shutting down the economy is actually doing more damage than the virus itself. This is something you're hearing much more today in the Israeli media and from experts and doctors. So we'll see what happens in the coming weeks and months. For now, Israel will go on a full lockdown for the 3 weeks that encompass the upcoming holidays. Regarding Netanyahu, the weekly protests continue out front of his home. As I noted, the rift in Israeli society is deeper than it has ever been, certainly way deeper than what it was 20, 25 years ago when I first arrived here. Sadly, for me as an American, it actually resembles the rift between American Democrats and Republicans today. It was refreshing to me to come here to Israel 25 years ago and see Israelis on opposite sides of the political spectrum still able to agree on things, still able to discuss things, still able to appreciate achievements of the other side. Because in America already that was almost not possible anymore at that point. Now Israel has reached that point as well. And it is unfortunate, but you see it very, very, very clearly in what happened yesterday and over the past month, in that even those who clamored for peace at any price, they said, for the past 3 decades, are now dismissive of an unprecedented set of agreements with Arab states that a year ago we couldn't have imagined having normalization with. They're dismissive of it just because Netanyahu was involved. He was the one who brokered it. So the rift is deep. Okay, I'm going to bring down this now, and we can have a short period of questions and answers if you all like. I'm going to leave you muted from my end, but you guys are welcome to unmute yourselves. If you want to speak, just please mute yourself again when you're done speaking.
Can I share something? Yeah. My question, Ryan, is that now that the Arab world is opening up to relations with Israel in this centenary of the San Remo Agreement, will that not put pressure on Jordan to, pull back from its illegal invasion in 1947 or whenever it was, and give Israel the sovereignty of the land it was originally given?
Jordan already years ago renounced any claim to the West Bank. They washed their hands of the West Bank entirely. They don't want the Palestinians to be their problem. So Jordan, as far as they're concerned, have no role in this dispute any longer. Despite the fact, of course, I mean, that's besides the fact that most of their population are Palestinians, and they have to remain diplomatically engaged for fear of their own population. But in terms of them having any legal say, they don't anymore. They renounced it.
Okay, thanks.
I could ask a question there, Ryan.
Yeah.
And Ryan, I think you did an excellent job on that. I hope we will be able to get the recording of that so that we can review that again, because that was worth a second time through. But Ryan, could you tell me what the relationship of Egypt is to all the other players in this peace agreement?
Egypt has remained relatively quiet. President al-Sisi has publicly endorsed the agreements between Israel and the Emirates and Bahrain. But besides that, he hasn't said much. Behind the scenes, it is almost certain that he's very supportive of this move because of the threat of Iran. Egypt, like all of the Gulf states, is very fearful of Iran's ambitions in the region, and these alliances are first and foremost by these Arab states seen as a way to bolster themselves against the Iranian threats, and Egypt will certainly be supportive of that.
Thank you.
Could I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
When you look at the whole situation there, and you had a verse from the Koran, and obviously if you're looking at the God of Islam, it's not the same God of Israel. It's Satan. It's a false God. So they write these things and it incites people and so on and so forth. But when you see what's been going on, I mean, we have the same thing going on here politically with our president as Netanyahu has with the Knesset there and all that. There's been this logjam, and in our country, you know, people promise this, they promise that, and really underneath it all, they're not giving it at all. That's not what they want at all. Here comes along a president like Trump, and what does he do? He breaks the logjam. He's basically doing an end run around the Palestinians, making them almost like a non-entity. And when I read in the scriptures, the actual word of God, what it says in Genesis 12:3, God says to Abraham, I will bless those that bless you. I will curse those that curse you. And through you, all the nations of the world will be blessed. So I would take that to be, that seems to me to be something that I can hang on to and say, this is truth, as opposed to what the Muslims are saying and inciting their people with. And also, you know, in 2 Timothy, it says, for God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. All these things that are happening, I can trust God, can I not? That he is orchestrating these things. The log jam is being broken. And how do we know? Perhaps is the groundwork being laid for Daniel 9:27, when a world leader comes and signs this final 7-year agreement with Israel that starts the tribulation. Is this what we're seeing happening today, in your opinion?
Look, again, like I mentioned before, obviously everything that's happening here is ultimately moving towards the finale of God's plans. Um, whether we're that far along in the timeline or not, I'm not sure. Certainly, things are moving very, very quickly in ways we didn't expect even 2 months ago. So it seems that way. I thought that it's important, though, and again, I don't want to come across as overly critical of these new accords. I just want to try to bring a little bit of balance, because if you just look at the news from Israel, everything is euphoria. And, rightly so, and it's understandable. Israelis have been dreaming of this again, and this is a dream come true to them. But there are aspects of it, especially for believers, that we need to keep an eye on. That's not to say that it will turn out that these particular countries are tricking Israel or playing a con or whatever else, or that they're going to revert to their Islamic teachings and actually become enemies again from within. Perhaps not. I mean, even in the New Testament, Jesus speaks of goat nations and sheep nations. Maybe these nations become sheep nations. Who knows? We also have to keep in mind the fact that whatever game these nations may be playing, if they are playing a game, Israel too will have its influence on them. They are going to come in contact with the people of Israel, the morals of Israel, the customs of Israel, and the God of Israel in a way that they never have before, because of these deals, because of their newfound friendship and partnerships and business dealings with Israelis. And that's going to have an influence on them. So who knows where these nations end up in the ultimate plan, in the ultimate scheme of things. Maybe this interpretation of Ezekiel that some Israelis have is correct. Maybe these nations are some of those that end up standing with Israel ultimately until the end, and standing against the enemies that try to destroy Israel. There's no, we just have to wait and see. I just think it's important that we keep a watchful eye and not go in one direction or the other before we truly can determine what's going on.
Thank you.
Someone asked on the comments, what is the status of the Temple Mount in the Abraham Accords, if this is going to mean that everyone can finally pray there? Of course, ridiculously, Jews are not allowed to pray on their holiest site in the world, even though it's under their control. There is some speculation in the Israeli media that the Abraham Accords, and in particular the specific deal with the UAE and the wording of the deal, actually leaves the door open to Jewish prayer on top of the Temple Mount, not just the Western Wall. It's very vague. Again, it's speculation. It could be that the people who authored that didn't mean that at all, but they did leave it open, and they did leave it vague. Whether that was on purpose or not, I don't know yet. We'll wait and see. But if it was on purpose, it's almost certainly going to lead to an explosion, possibly an explosion of violence. So I find it hard to believe that they meant that on purpose, but we'll have to wait and see.
Ryan?
Yeah.
I have a question. I sense in your voice, just in your describing this whole thing, the real hesitation and a certain sense of lack of euphoria, like the rest of the nation, which I think I share. I think maybe most believers do, because I don't think we can trust, like Jesus said, I know what's in the heart of man. And making alliances with any other nation may have some temporary advantages, but ultimately and that's at least to my question, especially in the Messianic Jewish community in Israel, what is the sense of that we don't want to give up any land to set up any state for anyone other than for Israel? Don't you know what I'm saying? No Palestinian state, no matter what size.
Mm-hmm. Look, again, generally speaking, Messianic Jews in Israel aren't much different from your average Israelis in this regard. In general, they oppose a Palestinian state for the same reason that Israelis in general oppose it. But also in general, they recognize that all of this needs to happen, that all these prophecies need to be fulfilled. But again, like I noted earlier, they would argue that, we're the ones that have to actually fight the wars. It's us who actually have to send our children out into battle. And as long as we can delay that, we prefer to delay that. So, you know, these kind of peace agreements are still exciting even amongst the Messianic body, but there's a little bit more discernment, of course, because they are looking at scripture. They are recognizing that ultimately Israel's path to prosperity, security, and peace is not through anything any man is going to offer them.
Mm-hmm.
Ryan, I was really surprised to read this week or last week to the Lebanese president, his desire to have peace with Israel. I was really surprised because of the Hezbollah is in Lebanon and the influence that this movement has on the Lebanon in general. What do you think about that?
Well, I was also very surprised by this, and even more so surprised because President Michel Aoun, the Lebanese president, is actually a puppet, more or less, a puppet of Hezbollah. He's very much allied with Hezbollah, despite the fact that he's a Christian. And the Lebanese Christians are generally opposed to Hezbollah and its control. He is allied with them for political reasons. You know, they keep him in power. So for him to come out and say something like that seemed quite risky, really. So I'm not sure exactly what was behind that. I am almost certain that there's American pressure behind it to some extent. And it could be that, you know, he's feeling the heat from the Lebanese street, which is fed up with Hezbollah's interference in the country and its ruining of the country. And I don't, you know, I can only hope and pray that he's turning a corner and realizing that he's been betting on the wrong horse and he needs to go back to his Christian constituency and doing what's right for the rest of Lebanon and not just for Hezbollah.
Okay, thanks.
Someone asked here in the comments, when I look at the news, Europe seems to be ignoring the Abraham Accords. Is that an underestimation of the situation on their part? Honestly, I would put it down to petty jealousy. You know, they've been laboring in the wrong way for decades to bring about some kind of breakthrough here. And all they have managed to do is create more conflict and strife. So, you know, I think that they simply don't like the fact, you know, they'll put up all kinds of diplomatic reasons about it, but I think underneath it all is that they simply don't like the fact that Donald Trump was the one who managed to do this, and that Israel was able to actually, you know, come to an accord with some of its Arab neighbors without their help. You know, they view themselves as, you know, the enlightened brokers who are able to help Israel get out of its troubles, and they don't like the fact that Israel managed to do it without them, I think.
So Ryan, will you be able to share the audio of this session with us?
Yeah, I've been double checking over and over again just to make sure I'm actually recording, but we are recording. So I'm going to put this up on YouTube in the next day or two, so you'll be able to go back over it again.
Excellent, thank you. I think you've done a wonderful job in what's the word I want? Transferring from the paper magazine to a digital format. Although one appreciates being able to hand on a paper magazine to someone else, I appreciate your daily news you're sending. You're still the most trustworthy source of news that I get regarding Israel and the Middle East, and I sure appreciate what Israel Today has done. And you're personally a new guy to me, a new kid on the block, but I take it you've been around for a while, and I think you're doing a very, very good job. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I would say you just so comprehensively covered the topic so well that if you've kind of taken out our questions, you've answered them already.
And can I say thank you for doing it at 11 p.m. at night there, because it makes it accessible here in Australia.
Oh, good. I was hoping so. I was hoping we'd have some people from Australia on. Okay, I'm glad to hear that it's not too early in the morning for you there.
No. When the 8 p.m. ones in Israel mean 3 a.m. here, and that's just a bit too hard.
Right.
Time.
I see we have a thank you from a jealous European in the comments. All right, everybody. Well, we'll certainly have much more to talk about and write about on this topic in the coming weeks. Hopefully we'll have another Zoom meeting soon and go over what's been happening since now. In the meantime, I want to wish you all a happy holiday season coming up. Again, please be sure to register and join David's upcoming Zoom meeting next Tuesday. He's going to go into a lot of the practical implications of the feasts for us Gentile believers, and I think it's really important.
So, Ryan,
All right.
this is
Yeah.
I have a question. Is there a regular schedule for these Zoom meetings, or not really?
At the moment, not really. We're trying to get into a routine, and we will eventually, but at the moment, it's just kind of as they come up.
So is the one next Tuesday at the same time, or do you know?
No, that one is at 8 p.m. Israel time.
Okay. Thank you. Shalom and lahitraot.
All right, everybody. Thank you for joining,
Shalom.
and we'll talk to you soon. Shalom.
Shalom.
Yeah.
Shalom.